We'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast was recorded, the Gadigal People of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present.
Today's story starts halfway down a mountain. It's June 1992, and Jim Davidson is climbing Mount Rainier in Washington State with his buddy Mike Price. They've been climbing their whole lives, but this is a challenge even for them. A multi-day expedition full of ice and snow to a very high altitude. They climb for 14 hours a day and sleep strapped to the mountain on small ledges carved into the ice. Despite the tough conditions, they reach the summit after 4 days. Still high on this incredible achievement, they start to make their way back down. The weather is glorious, blue skies, glittering snow and breathtaking views. But the mountain is covered in glaciers. Blankets of ice covering crevasses that tunnel deep down beneath the snow. For safety, they're roped together by their harnesses in case one of them falls. Jim's out in front. It's getting warm and they're making good time until Jim takes a step and sinks down to his ankle, then past his knee. He shouts out to Mike, but his head is already well beneath the snow. He's falling and he's not stopping. I'm at Middleton and this is Head Game. Today, an extraordinary story of perseverance in spite of loss and what it takes to turn traumatic experiences into positive life lessons. Thank you ever so much for coming on my podcast, Head Game. Now, you're like myself, Jim. You sound like you're a glutton for punishment. You like putting yourself in these awkward situations and living life on the edge, but it can come at a cost, can't it?
Yes.
Talk to me about your life before climbing. You're a geologist, is that correct?
Correct. I was a geologist, but probably more importantly to my climbing, I grew up working for my father's industrial painting company near Boston, Massachusetts. And so I was climbing ladders when I was 8 years old and walking roofs when I was 12 years old. I could operate a man-lift crane before I could drive a car. So I just kind of grew up in this environment where we'd have a small group of people working very hard to get a difficult task done, no matter what the weather was, and also depending upon each other for success and for safety. So that's kind of the way I grew up, and I think it's in my DNA now.
When did the climbing first come into fruition? When did you think, you know what, I want to get out and I want to climb, but taking it seriously?
Well, I think it came in a couple of phases. I first started reading books at my local library about these polar explorers like Stott and Amundsen, and I dreamed of what it would be like to go on big adventures like that. But it seemed like that era had passed me by 100 years or so. And then I found the next shelf over had mountaineering books. And I started reading these expedition books about these far-off places like the Andes and the Himalayas. And I dreamed of doing that. But frankly, I wasn't very athletic. I was a slow runner. I was not very good at team sports. So I didn't see it coming in my life at all. But around 19 years old, I started backpacking in the wilderness, and I realized that I didn't have to be fast or a ball sports player. I could just apply my physical skills to move through the wilderness. And very slowly it began to dawn on me that if I kept setting higher goals, maybe I could climb the mountains nearby that were barely 2,000 meters, and maybe over years climb even higher peaks. And that's when my climbing life began to unfold.
Do you know what? That's fascinating, Jim. So basically, the power of reading, books, grabbing a book, the inspiration that you can get from books. I think that's a hugely important message, especially for youngsters nowadays. Get out there, read. You never know what it might ignite within you. And obviously the books ignited this life of adventure and mountaineering. What was your first mountain, classed as a mountain that you climbed?
The first one of any size would be Mount Washington in the state of New Hampshire. It's about 6,200 feet, so just roughly about 2,000 meters. But it's one of the coldest, windiest places on the planet. And very early on, I learned to have a lot of respect for the mountains. You may think you're tough, you may think you're strong, but the mountains are infinitely more strong than we are. So I learned that I had to gain knowledge from people who knew more than me, and I read a lot of books. And I took some training classes early on because I was aware of how little I actually knew. So I've kind of had this process since the beginning of just slowly gaining skills and slowly expanding my world. And it took me really years until I started climbing bigger mountains out in the western United States, and probably 15 years before I went on my first expedition. So I'm a believer in building a solid base, knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know, and then building a team around you to compensate for that lack of knowledge that you might have.
Yeah, that's wise and smart. And you look at the smaller mountains like that have the bad weather windows, that have the bad conditions. That's actually where you learn the most. You know, I remember climbing Ben Nevis in Scotland, and exactly the same. You know, you got tourists that are going up in trainers with a protein bar in their pocket, and then all of a sudden the weather comes in, and they have to be evacuated off the mountain because they don't know what they're doing. They're ill prepared. Walk before you can run, and jog before you can sprint. Because there's a difference between hiking. When I say to people, listen, you're going to go on a nice hard hike, but then you go into that element of climbing where you've got the crampons, you've got the equipment. What was your first mountain where you experienced the difference between hiking and climbing?
That would probably be Mount Baker up in the state of Washington in the northwest corner of the States. It's about 10,800 feet tall. So kind of modest, moderately tall, but it has glaciers on it. And when I went on that first glacier, I knew I was in a whole nother environment. I had done some practicing ice climbing and had about two years of ice climbing experience when I went there. But now I had to combine all these skills of hiking and rock scrambling and navigation and do it all with crampons on around crevasses. And most importantly, rope to my teammates, because I'm their backup for safety and they are there to back me up. And so all of those together just really made me realize this was a complex set of skills and I need to get good at all of them in order to be able to keep advancing in my mountaineering.
Take me back to a very, I would say, life-changing moment in your life on Mount Rainier in Washington State with your climbing buddy Mike Price, because talk about being out there by yourselves and having each other. You're alive today because of your climbing buddy Mike Price. But if you could take us back to that morning, when you're excited to climb, you're getting your equipment on, you're probably shooting the breeze, you're just about to go on a super exciting sort of climb. And then, can you tell us what unfolds thereafter? But take us through the day when you're with Mike.
We were climbing Mount Rainier, 14,410 feet, a big glaciated peak with about 26 different glaciers, and some of them can be up to 6 miles long, and the ice can be 1,000 feet thick. And I've been climbing about 10 years, so I was pretty experienced by then. I'd been to Mount Rainier once before. We didn't summit because the weather turned bad. But my partner, Mike, was more experienced than me. He had 14 years of climbing, and he was an instructor for Outward Bound. He was on the search and rescue at McMurdo Sound in Antarctica. So he was very experienced. He was a more senior partner, for sure, because he had so much more experience. But we've been friends and partners for about 6 years. So we tackled a difficult route on Mount Rainier called the Liberty Ridge, which is really a difficult alpine climb. And like you say, it's just the two of us. Normally on a glacier, you climb in bigger teams, more people on the rope for more safety. But in the alpine environment, it's so steep and technical, you really can only move as a team of two because we're waiting half the time for our other partner to climb the technical sections. So in an alpine climb like this, we're going to be carrying our rock climbing gear, ice climbing gear, snow climbing gear, rope, and we're going to be on the mountain for 4 days in the case of the Liberty Ridge on Rainier. So we have stove, food, fuel, sleeping bags, tents. You can't carry any extra weight, but even still, your pack gets quite heavy, 15 kilos, maybe more. And so you're going to be carrying these heavy packs, which really adds to the weight. And I know you know that from your climbing experience as well as your military, that extra pack really weighs you down, and you have to move as a team simultaneously. So you almost have to have an innate knowledge of your partner, because we can't talk. We're 150 feet apart on the rope, and we're both doing different things. So you have to have great trust in your partner, great trust in your own skills, and the confidence that together you can move smoothly over ever-changing terrain.
And trust in your equipment as well. That's a huge part of any sort of expedition like this. You've got to trust in your equipment, because any sort of seed of doubt in your head, then it could be the difference between a successful climb and a non-successful climb.
Absolutely. Yeah, you have to trust the equipment, and you have to know that your partner knows how to use that equipment and that you know how to use that equipment without fail. Because if we're both moving at once, one piece of equipment could save both our lives or cost us both our lives. So you have to have deep knowledge and trust so that we can move over this mixed, difficult terrain day after day.
So it's June 1992, Jim. You're going alpine climbing with your buddy Mike Price. How does the morning start?
Well, we've been on the mountain for 3.5 days, and we've climbed over 10,000 vertical feet since we left our car. We crossed 2 glaciers and then climbed up a big, tall alpine ridge. To save weight, we left our tent behind, so we slept out under the stars, or bivouacked, as they say. And we made great progress, but we were really tired because we'd had some 12 and 16-hour days. So when we woke up on the morning of the 4th day, we're only about 200 meters from the summit, but we were slow. We kind of dragged our way up the easy summit snow slopes, but we were just so glad to be there because for 3.5 days, we've been moving together, taking turns belaying each other on the difficult technical parts. So we're so glad to stand on the summit. It was a beautiful day. We could see off 100 miles in every direction. There were a few other climbers there that come up easier routes, and somebody took our photo with my arm over Mike's shoulder and his over mine. And we were just so relieved. And frankly, it was a big step up in our partnership because it was a difficult route and it kind of cemented the quality of our partnership that had been building for 6 years.
So when you say that you're drained physically, but psychologically, when you reach that summit, you are completely drained. But the moment almost takes it away. But, reality is that every part of your being is drained. Is that correct?
Yes, because there's all kinds of challenges. There's ice cliffs and loose rock and bad weather and those crevasses. And the crevasses are those big cracks in the ice. And the glacier is flowing downhill, and some parts move fast and some move slow. And it opens up these tension cracks that we call crevasses. And sometimes they're obvious cracks that we can simply walk around because we can see them. But sometimes they're hidden because so much snow falls. It forms a temporary bridge that we call a snowbridge. And as you said, we have to probe for those because they're hidden underneath the surface of the snow. So with every step we take, we're jamming our ice axe in once or twice beforehand to make sure it sounds solid and feels solid. And then you can take one small step forward for the team. And then you do it again and again. So over the course of 3.5 days, we probably jabbed our ice axes in tens of thousands of times over and over again to keep ourselves and our partner safe. It's just what we have to do to stay on top of this ever-changing situation underneath our feet.
Yeah, and then you get to the summit and it's almost, all this hard work, we're here at the top, but obviously not switching off because actually you've got to get back down. What did that feel like?
Yeah, it was such a great feeling after 3.5 days of hard work. And I said to Mike, I could have never done this climb without you. I know other climbers, but nobody was up to doing this kind of a climb before with me. And he said the same thing. He said, I've climbed with a lot of people and I couldn't have gotten here without you. So it made me really convinced that it was a mutual feeling that it was 1 and 1 made more than 2. We brought out the best in each other and we were able to take that risk and do that hard work over and over again. But you're right. When you're on the summit, as we say in mountaineering, as you know, we're only halfway there. And now comes the dangerous part because gravity is helping us come downhill, but it can pull you too fast, especially if your legs are tired or your brain relaxes too much, you let your guard down. So we reminded each other on the way down, hey, that's where a lot of accidents can happen. So we kind of dust ourselves off and wipe the smile off our face and put a serious game face back on to get ready for the challenge ahead.
Yes, you take in the views, you appreciate the hard work that you've done together, and then you take that deep breath, look at each other and go, right, let's stay switched on. Let's get down together. So what time did you summit? And then what time did you decide to head back down? And how long did you sort of calculate that would take you to get to the bottom?
Well, we summited at about 8:30 in the morning because we had slept very high in the mountain, just 200 meters below the summit. And it's a pretty straightforward route back down because we can't go back the way we came up. It's much too steep and there's too much rockfall and things like that. So we're going to go down an easier route where many other climbers have been coming up the last few days. So it's not particularly steep. It's about 35 degrees overall. And there's tracks in the snow from other climbers. So we figured to get down off the edge of the glacier would take us about 4 hours or so. And then we probably have another 4 or 5 hours through the woods back to our car. And by the end of the day, we hope to be having beers and burgers in a pub somewhere. So we still had a long day ahead of us, but it should get easier as we go downhill.
Wow. So you're looking at each other on the summit and you think to yourself, by the end of play today, we'll be together, having a beer, having some good food, and, making your way back to your families, right?
Yep, that was the plan. And Mike and I like to kind of tease each other a bit. So as we were descending the mountain, now the sun is out because it was June 21st, which is the first day of summer and the longest day of the year, the sunniest day of the year. So the snow's kind of getting soft and the sun's just kind of baking us. And we'd be going along kind of a little dehydrated and tired. And suddenly Mike would stop out front. He'd turn back and he'd go, "Hey, Jim." I'd say, "What?" He'd say, "Whatever you do, don't think about a cold beer right now." He's making me crazy, of course. And that was his primary intention, just to tease me, So we're trying to have a little fun even though we were tired on the way down.
I think that's a hugely important point, is that humor in the face of adversity. You still had to go down, you still knew that, you had a hard day's work ahead of you. And that sort of shooting the breeze like that is huge for morale. It keeps you boosted. It keeps you motivated. But unfortunately, you didn't make it down for those beers, did you?
No, we didn't, Ant. As we were going down the mountain, we were making good headway, and we dropped down to 13,000 feet and 12,000 feet. And we're within maybe 40 minutes of being off the glacier. And we can actually almost see the base camp at the base of the mountain where other climbers are camped out. And we were going along, and Mike and I would take turns. He would lead for an hour. And then your brain gets kind of tired. Your eyes get tired by studying the snow so hard. So we would switch the leads about once an hour. And it was my turn to take the front. So I went out front. And Mike and I were tied together by about 15 to 20 meters of rope at this point. So we each had a little extra coil of rope on our shoulders to work with in case we needed to pull each other out of a tough spot. So we're moving together, and I was probing with my ice axe, as we had been for tens of thousands of times over the last 3 or 4 days. And I probed ahead, and the snow looked solid, and it felt solid. And when I stuck my axe in it, it firmed up in the snow. But when I took that next step and put my foot forward, my foot sank in up to my shin, and then up to my knee. And at first I thought it was just soft snow and it'll firm up underneath my foot. But that's not what happened. Suddenly I started accelerating, and I realized I was no longer standing on a solid glacier. I was standing on a big, weak snow bridge going across a huge crevasse. And that snow bridge was starting to collapse beneath my feet.
And that happens within a split second, right? Split second.
Absolutely. I didn't even think about it. I actually heard myself yelling, "Falling!" That would give Mike a chance to drop to the snow and dig in with his ice axe and catch my fall. But I couldn't even turn around because this was all happening so fast. And immediately I sunk up to my waist, and I tried to slam my axe onto the surface of the snow. And the pick went in all the way to the head of the axe, which means a really deep burial in the snow. But it's about noontime now on June 21st, the longest, sunniest day of the year. And the top snow was all wet and soft, and my ice axe pick just cut right through the snow like a knife through butter. And I realized I couldn't stop myself. And then all of a sudden, my head went underneath the snow bridge, and everything went dark. And I realized I was inside the crevasse and accelerating into the mountain.
Wow. So this happens in a split second. I know it all too well. Your foot goes in, you go down to your knee, and you just think, do you know what? I've got a bit of tough snow in front of me. I'm steady. I'm just going to plow through. Then whack, before you know it, you're completely covered. So you're in the crevasse and you're completely covered. How do you communicate with Mike?
Well, at this point, we're in two different worlds. I'm inside the crevasse, and there's just a little man-sized hole about 2 feet across that had collapsed beneath my feet. The rope goes up through that hole and back to Mike. So I'm plummeting vertically into the darkness. I'm swinging my ice axe around, trying to hook the sidewalls, and I couldn't reach either sidewall. And I realized, oh, this is a big crevasse. And I knew my partner, Mike, would be digging in because he's so well-trained. And I know he was digging in. I wasn't going super fast, but my brain started guessing how far in I'd gotten. I couldn't talk to Mike because he was above the snow and I'm below it. And I started picking up speed, and my brain guessed I'd gone 20 feet in, 30 feet in. And I thought, that's not right. Mike should have stopped me by now. Then my brain guesses 40 feet. I thought, 40 feet? We're only separated by about 50 feet of rope. I thought, come on, Mike, stop me. I felt the rope jerk once, and I slowed down, and I almost stopped. And then I accelerated twice as fast into the darkness. Now, I didn't know what that meant at the time. I was just overwhelmed with the sensations, and I couldn't figure out what was happening. But I know now what happened, which was my partner, Mike, did his job. And he dug in to the snow and slowed me down for the first 50 feet as I fell into the crevasse. But as I went deeper, the rope pulled Mike closer and closer to the lip of the crevasse. And the same wet snow that caused me to fall into the crevasse in the first place wouldn't let Mike stop. And he got pulled over the lip of the crevasse, pulled into the crevasse, and tied together, the two of us sailed deeper inside the mountain into the darkness.
So when you're falling and Mike is obviously on the other end of the rope, do you then see Mike go past you in the crevasse, or do you stop together? How does that pan out when you now know that actually Mike is in the crevasse with me?
Yeah, when I thought I'd been falling first in the first 50 feet because it felt fast to me. But once Mike got pulled in and gravity had a full grip on us, I just kept accelerating even faster and faster. And that's when I knew that he had to be in there with me. We were both free falling. And I thought for sure we'd be dead. There's a word for this, as you know, in climbing. When you fall in a crevasse, crevasses get skinnier and skinnier, narrower and narrower as you go down. And when you fall in with great velocity, you can get stuck in there, wedged in like a cork in a wine bottle. And I thought, man, we're going to get corked at the bottom of this thing. And I hit one wall lightly with my shoulder, and I began to ricochet from one wall to the other, getting beat up as I went, hitting my head, hitting my back. And that probably took a little speed off me, but all of a sudden, I slammed to a stop. The air burst out of my lungs, kind of, and, I lost my breath. And I looked up and I saw a little point of light, and I couldn't understand what the light was. In fact, it was the surface of the snow far above my head. And then all of a sudden, wet snow started falling on my legs. And that was the snow bridge that had collapsed, and the snow that Mike had sort of snow plowed into that little hole. So all this huge, massive snow, like a truckload of snow, started falling down and started burying me from my feet upwards. And I panicked and tried to sit up, but my pack was wedged, corked between the two ice walls that were about 1.5 feet apart from one another. So I couldn't sit up and I couldn't stand up. I was stuck, facing upward, lying down towards the surface as the snow just piled up on me and up and up. And I was afraid I was going to get totally buried. So I put my hands over my head like I'd learned in avalanche survival class. And then a big impact hit with a lot of weight. I figured out later that was Mike and his pack and more snow. Mike landed on me and more snow fell on. And if someone had been standing there when it all stopped, it would have just probably been a pile of snow with a little rope and a little bit of gear sticking out, because both Mike and I were buried.
Wow. That's giving me goosebumps, because I've done, crevasse training, and, it all, comes together in training because it's all in a controlled and safe environment. When everything comes to a halt and you're there in complete silence, what's your next thought process? What is going through your head in that very moment once everything sort of stops and you realize, actually, I'm in a real bad situation here?
It was so overwhelming because it had all happened in just a second or two. I falling through the crevasse, falling through the air, landing in the snow falling on me. I thought to myself, I can't believe this. I just survived the fall somehow, and I can still think, yet I'm trapped. I'm buried. I tried to push with my arms and legs, and I couldn't get out. And that's when panic started setting in. I thought, I've got to get out. I can't breathe. I had managed to keep one hand in front of my face, and I had a small air pocket about the size of a football. But I knew that wouldn't last very long, so I'm trying to push and push. And I'd heard in avalanche survival class and avalanche training classes that if you get buried by avalanche debris, it's like being held down by 1,000 cold, wet hands. And that's what it felt like to me. I could feel the cold and the wetness and the moisture, but I was panicking so bad in my chest because I knew that I needed air any second now. And I pushed and pushed, and eventually my good right arm burst out of the snow, and I swept away a little snow. I only had about maybe 10 inches of snow pile up on my face. So I swept the snow a little bit and spit out a snowball that had jammed in my mouth and caught a few rushed breaths. And I realized I was okay and I could breathe, but I was buried right up to my chin. And I could see a little bit of Mike's gear nearby, but in the darkness, I couldn't see where he was. I knew he had to be nearby because I knew he fell in with me. And I yelled, Mike, where are you? Pull me out before it freezes. Because I'm thinking, we're trapped in this wet snow. And there's ice on both sides of us, the glacial ancient ice. It's going to freeze the whole thing into a mass of ice pretty soon. And I'd hoped that he'd go, oh, there you are, Jim, and pull me out. But that's not what happened. When he answered back, he didn't answer back with words. He answered with a groan. And I knew my friend and partner was hurt really bad.
So you're literally 80 feet in this crevasse. Just describe the environment. So you've managed to dig yourself out of, I can only describe it as an ice coffin. You're now free up to your waist. Mike is obviously at arm's length away from you. Is that correct?
Correct.
And can you see any light when you look up? or are you completely in the darkness?
There was a little bit of light. I could see shapes pretty well, and I could see a little bit of colors. But the thing is, when sunlight goes through the ice filters out the reds and yellow and green wavelengths. So the only light that gets through is blue. And the deeper you go into crevasse, the bluer it gets. And this is the bluest crevasse I'd ever seen. It was a deep, dark blue, deep, dark shadows everywhere. And I could feel the fear above me. I could feel something looming above me. But frankly, I was so focused on Mike, I didn't have time. And I also think then I didn't have the courage to look up. I knew that there was something really bad up above our heads, but I had to keep doing CPR on Mike. So I was doing compressions on him, and I was trapped behind him. I was basically reaching with my arm around him from his back and touching his chest with the palm of my hand. And I knew it wasn't the right way to give compressions. I'm supposed to be above him and get both palms and my body weight into it, but it's all I could do. So I was behind him. I kept pressing his chest back against my own and sort of squeezing him between my one hand and my own breastbone. And I kept it up for a long time. And then I'd give him some breaths, and I cleared his airway, and I gave him more breaths. And I kept it up for a while, and I was starting to panic because I was hoping that I would just give him 2 or 3 breaths and that he would suddenly wake up and go, "Oh, I'm fine. Thanks for doing that, Jim." But that's not what happened. And after maybe another 20 minutes of CPR, I realized it wasn't coming around. And I knew I was supposed to keep it going to keep him alive, but I also knew I couldn't keep it up forever because I'm still trapped in the snow and it's going to freeze solid. And one person can't do CPR for hours or days. It just doesn't work. But I kept going for a while longer, and I checked vitals a second time, and I still didn't feel anything. And I finally had to stop. And I knew my good friend and partner, Mike, was deceased. And my head just dropped onto his chest. My chin started quivering in fear, and water started filling my eyes up. And I was just ready to give up. I thought, Mike's the better climber here. If he's dead, I'm going to be dead soon too. And I felt like just giving up before I could even get the courage to look up and see where we were.
And whilst all this is happening, you're still attached to him on a rope, aren't you? You are still attached together like an umbilical cord whilst you're giving the CPR, whilst you're doing everything. Is that correct?
Absolutely. We're still a team. We're still tied together. And that rope was all weaving in and out of the snow pile that Mike and I were still buried in. And he was sort of on top of me, but the rope goes in and out of the snow, and it's all starting to get wet from water dripping from above. And I can feel the cold emanating out of the ice walls. They were only about 2 feet apart where we were. We were on a little pile of snow about 6 or 7 feet long and about 2 feet wide. And I assumed we were on the bottom of the crevasse because that made sense. We fell to the bottom. And even though I was ready to give up and start crying, I had a little voice in the back of my head that was like, "You've got to get out. Get out of the snow before you freeze in." And I got this rush of panic again. So I started thrashing at the snow, and I dug my way out. It took me 20 minutes. I tried to rush it. My knee was torqued. I was buried underneath a piece of ice and the pack. And as soon as I got out, I got above Mike, and I could do compressions the right way. So I started in again. But it had been, 40 minutes by now since I'd heard him breathe. And it didn't bring him back. And again, my head dropped onto his chest. And then I began to think about the question that you asked. Where are we? What's above us? And I was very fearful. But I kind of sat up on my knees and started looking up. And the ice walls were about 2 feet apart where we were. Then they spread out to about 3 and 4 feet apart from one another. And the angle was about 70 degrees and then 80 degrees. And then I looked up, up, and up, and the walls were dead vertical. And they got out to about 6 feet apart from one another. And then I looked up, up, up. And way up top, the walls started overhanging to come back together. And that's where the snowbridge was at the top of the crevasse. And that hole in the snowbridge, that way back to the world, was about 80 feet above our heads. And I said in a quivering voice, "Oh, man, Mike, we are in trouble. We are in big, big trouble." I had no idea how we could ever get out of that.
I want to ask you a really difficult question. You're attached to your buddy. You realise that he's no longer with you. You look up and you think, right, I've got to get out of here. 1, I've got to get out of here to tell our story. 2, to get to safety so we can potentially get Mike's body back. 3, hopefully one of us will live to live on the legacy of one another. But that moment when you realise he's gone and you have to unclip from your partner, almost leaving him there, that must have been one of the toughest decisions in your life.
It was the symbolism of unclipping from him was too great. But partners are supposed to take care of each other in the mountains, in life, in the military. We don't leave people behind. I couldn't bring Mike back from the dead. I knew that, but he was still my partner and still my responsibility. So as I started slowly trying to figure out how I might be able to climb this wall, I didn't really believe I could because I was a good ice climber, but not world class. And back then in 1992, nobody was climbing overhanging ice like that. Certainly not me. We had straight shafted and straight pick tools back then. It was just beyond even the best pros in the world. So I had to untie him at one point, but I never wanted to leave him unanchored. So I worked a system out of using a second anchor. I put an ice screw into the wall and I anchored his body to that. And then I had to take the rope off him because I was going to need the full rope to climb out. But before I started that climbing, I again tied Mike back into the end of the rope. So before I even started climbing, I figured I had 150 feet of rope between my body and his, and we were still a team, and I was going to have to make it out of there on that rope because that's all the rope I had. I refused to start climbing untied to my partner. So that I worked out a complicated system to make sure he was always secured and that we were still connected. And as you can tell, it's an emotional memory, but I think it was part of what the strength that I needed to start climbing because I wasn't climbing out just for me. I was climbing out for Mike because my friend had just given his life to save mine. I couldn't not have the courage to even try and finish the job. So I think staying connected to Mike was critical to me starting. And later on, when I ran out of strength and confidence on the wall several times, I would pull on the rope and feel Mike's body down below stretching with the dynamic climbing cord. And that would remind me that I was climbing not just for me, but for him too, and for his family. So I could look them in the eye and tell them what happened. So staying connected with your partners, in this case, physically or through a rope or emotionally, is critical to doing your best even after those partners are gone.
Keeping that attachment, like you said, anchoring Mike to the ice, always having him on your rope. Do you think that was the difference between you being alive and getting out of that crevasse, and ultimately from you staying and potentially perishing with Mike?
Absolutely. I think it saved my life at 3 different points. One was he truly dug in. See, I survived that fall in the 80-foot crevasse because Mike slowed me down for the first 50 feet. I only free fell the last 30 feet into the snow. So he saved my life in the fall. Unfortunately, there was no one behind him to slow him down. He took the full effects of falling the 80 feet. That's why he was critically injured and passed away. And then being attached to him both emotionally and physically through the rope is what gave me the courage to start climbing that wall. I think having him present, even though I knew he was passed away, he was so present with me. I thought he saved my life over and over that day. And even now, 31 years later, I still look back on that and I draw strength from that when I face tough things in life on other mountains or in my personal life.
How hard was that climb up, Jim?
It took over 4 hours. It was the longest lead climb I'd ever done.
Wow.
I tried to do a head-to-toe exam of myself to see if I had any injuries before I left, but I decided if something was broken or in pain, I didn't even want to know. So I stopped my self-exam right away. It took me a while to figure out how to climb because I'd read about these things and practiced them once years before, but never done them in reality. So I could free climb for the first 20 feet stemming off the 2 walls, but once the walls got far apart, I had to revert over to aid climbing using the gear to advance or aid my way up the wall. And that got me about 35 feet up, and then I ran out of ice screws. We went from 6 to 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 to 0. And that's when I realized that with no ice screws, there was no way to climb the upper half of the wall. So the bottom ice screws mechanically weren't doing me much good anymore. So I realized that to go up, I was going to have to go down to the bottom of the crevasse, take the bottom ice screws out, struggle to climb back to my high point, and then try and go up another few feet.
So you were literally improvising, adapting, and overcoming on the spot. You were, let's say, making this up as you were going along, right? Talk about adapting to any given situation. Wow, you were just figuring this out on the go.
Yeah, when I was standing on the ledge looking up, I figured I needed about 20 ice screws, 40 carabiners to get out. We had 6 ice screws and about 15 carabiners. I figured I needed 2 sliding mechanical clamps called Jumars. I had none. I could have used 2 or 3 sets of aid steps, little steps made out of nylon. I had none. So I jury rigged things. We had some rock gear with us because we did climb rock sections on our alpine route. And so I made a chain of carabiners and cams, little spring-loaded devices, and I would just cram my crampon points into the cams and twist it in the wire and stand up on it because I had no nylon steps to use. So I was pushing gear way beyond what it was designed for. And I went up and down that wall, pulling ice screws out, putting them back in, and I did it for a total of about 4 hours. And I finally got up to within striking distance of the surface, and I used my last ice screw to get past the overhang. And even though I was totally exhausted, I realized I was going to have to go back to free climbing again. But I got very lucky because there had been warm air drooling in the crevasse now. And the walls got softer as I got closer to the surface. So that brutally hard ice down bottom slowly gave way to soft ice. I wasn't trusting the ice screws very much anymore, but now I could swing my ice tools and kick my crampons, and the wall eased back to a steep but manageable 70 degrees. So I kind of had to go back to the technique that I'd done before. And I was scared out of my mind because I was exhausted by then. I tried to eat and drink, but whenever I did, I would throw it up and throw up some blood with it. And I remembered something that Mike had taught me. Years before, he was climbing really steep snow. And after he led that section, and I followed him, I was nervous just following him. And I said, "Aren't you afraid you were going to fall?" And he just looked at me calmly and he said, "No." He said, "I can't fall, so I'm not going to." And that was bearing heavy in my mind when I got on the steep upper wall. I realized that if I was afraid of falling, I probably would. So even though I knew the chances of succeeding were very small, I had to act confident, and maybe somehow that confidence would give me enough strength and courage to climb that last 15 feet of steep snow. And it did, and eventually I slid it onto the surface, and I was out, but I was a broken man, and I was in the middle of a big glacier all by myself at the end of the day.
You were left with just one option that day, and that was you need to get out of this crevasse. You need to find a way to climb out of this crevasse. Now, if you would have looked at that and you, in the day during training, you would have said that was impossible. There's no way I'll even attempt it. It's impossible. But how powerful when it comes to a life and death situation and you're left with one option, how powerful is it? And how much are we truly capable of psychologically, physically, and emotionally? It goes beyond any possible realm, right?
You're absolutely right. I mean, when I was first looking up, I was in fear of my life. I wanted to get home and see my wife again. It was sort of about me and everything. And I thought, I don't think I can do this. And I thought, well, I had to try. Even though I was overwhelmed with fear and doubt, I couldn't not try. My friend had just given his life to set me up to give me this chance. I have to honor that by doing my best. And I realized that there were all these problems and setbacks. I had no idea how I was going to solve them. I was way out of my league technically, but I realized that I really only had to do one thing, was just keep climbing until I made it out or I died. And when I realized it was that simple, that pain and fear and injuries and spitting up blood and the numbness I felt, I'd crushed something in my neck, so I had numbness in my hand and my leg. I thought, none of that matters. I just have to keep going. It's very simple. Keep climbing until you die. And it actually calmed me down a lot because there was only one option left. And as I got up the wall, and as I said, as I wore out, I began to realize I was climbing for Mike and his family, for my wife, to see my parents again. And I realized that this had gotten way beyond me. Me getting out was not certain. Even if I made it out, I might not live from my injuries or from the psychological heaviness of all this, but I owed it to all of them to try harder. And that kept me going. When I couldn't seem to move anymore, I would put in one more ice screw for somebody else in my life. And that's when I think a deep source of personal resilience can rise up. And you can do almost anything when you're doing it for somebody else, for people that matter to you.
Yeah, that's so powerful, because I've been in those situations where I've got one option only, and if I don't make the most of that option, or if I don't at least commit or try to achieve that option, then yeah, I wouldn't be here. So you get to the top. Talk to me at that moment when you realise that you're safe. You realise, so you go from this death-defying experience where, you make one mistake, you're there with Mike, you're never to be seen again, to this moment where you can almost take that weight off your shoulders. Where can you remember that moment when you think, right, I'm safe. I can now, start really breaking this down and getting to Mike to bring his body back? Yeah,
it kind of came in a couple of phases. When I first crawled onto the surface, I was totally terrified that somehow the rope was going to drag me back in, like the crevasse was a living monster and it was going to yank me back in. So I crawled a few feet away, and I didn't even trust myself enough to stand up anymore because I'd been hanging off the ice screws from this vertical realm for over 4 hours at this point, maybe 5. And so I crawled forward, and I had one small piece of snow protection. So I beat that in with a hammer. I tied a knot, and I double checked it, and I clipped Mike into it to make sure that the rope back to him was anchored. I didn't want to lose control of that rope. And then all I had left was my 2 ice tools. I had nothing left. I didn't bring a pack with me or anything because couldn't carry the weight. So I used my ice hammer to pound my ice axe in and use that as a secondary anchor and tied myself to that. I double checked that Mike's anchored, I'm anchored, the team's safe. And then I could finally admit that I was out. And I just kind of leaned forward in the snow and started crying like a baby for a few minutes, just sort of an emotional release. And I felt like I could feel myself start to shake from the cold and nerves, but I realized I wasn't safe. I was out of the crevasse, but I'm in the middle of this huge glacier surrounded by hundreds of other crevasses. It's about 5 or 5:30 in the afternoon on a Sunday night. And it was Father's Day here in the States. And so most of the other climbers had left the mountain. I was the only one on this whole glacier, and the sun's going to go down in a couple of hours. And so I realized I needed to somehow get help. And I stood up and I looked down, and I could see a ranger station about 1,000 vertical feet below me. And it was pretty low angle. I thought I could walk down that, but I thought there's got to be dozens, if not 100 crevasses between me and the edge of that glacier. I can't risk falling in. So I realized I was going to have to stay there. So I tried to yell, and I had no voice. So I ate some wet snow to kind of get my voice back. And I yelled and waved my arms. And eventually someone came out of the ranger's hut, and they couldn't hear my words, but they could hear, hey, hey, in the distance. They realized something was wrong. And I could sort of see people scrambling around, putting on packs and tying ropes in. And I knew that help would be coming. And then I just had to sit there by the edge of the crevasse and try not to get hurt and try not to collapse mentally in the 2 hours it took them to get to me. And I just sat on the edge of the crevasse, and every once in a while I would pull the rope and feel Mike down there, and it would remind me that he was still with me. And I just had to sit there and wait for those 2 rangers and those 2 volunteers to get to me.
And the next day, how hard was not only the conversation with your family, but the conversation with Mike's family? Do you mind taking us back to that conversation?
Yeah, you're right. It's not easy. It's terrifying. I had to tell the story a little bit to the Rangers for their investigation, and then I told it to my wife when I got home. But it comes out in small pieces because it's so traumatic and it's so terrifying. It comes out in pieces, and they were all very patient with me. But I had to take the next and most important step was to call Mr. and Mrs. Price and Mike's brother Daryl and go over to their house. They lived nearby in Fort Collins, Colorado. And when we walked up to that door, I think I was more afraid of introducing myself to them than I was in the crevasse, because I didn't know, were they going to yell at me and hate me and hit me? And I just thought, I'm just going to not even fight back. I'm just going to let them vent as they need to, because they've lost their beloved son. But I'd never met them before, but I was wrong in my judgment that they might be difficult to me some way. In fact, they were quite the opposite. They were comforting and loving, and we got to know each other a little bit. And then finally I said, I'll tell you anything you want to know. I tried to be polite in how I told the story so as not to dwell on difficult moments, but I wanted to be 100% honest, because Mike was an honest guy, and I owed it to him and his parents to be 100% honest too. So I told him about the scary moments and about all the things that Mike had done to give me a chance and how I tried to get out. And they not only accepted me with open arms and a warm spirit, they grieved with me, and that was 31 years ago, and they're still friends of mine now. I'm proud that we are still connected and talk regularly. We basically kind of become mutual family through this tragedy, and we can still support each other a little bit today.
Wow. Jim, please tell me that you're carrying on his legacy by continuing to climb. Is that the case, or have you decided after that it's a no-go?
I took right after the injury, after the accident, I had injuries both physically and mentally for a while. So it took me a while to heal up and then sort of slowly get back to the mountains. But I asked myself that question for many months, and I thought, probably no one would blame me if I just go, you know what? The mountains are scary. It took my best friend's life. It almost killed me. I'm not going back there. But I thought, I still like the mountains, even though they are scary now, and I have some hard feelings about what happened and some upset feelings for sure. But they'd given me all this joy, and they'd meant all these important things to me and Mike, how we could try and refine ourselves into a better version of ourselves, and how we would work together, and 1 + 1 made more than 2 in the mountains. That I started slowly getting back first into hiking, than easy rock climbing. It got scary the first day I went ice climbing. It got scary when I went on my first glacier. But what really did it is that somebody asked me, by then they said, hey, Jim, you've been a climber for 20 years. I know you've been to Nepal once as a trekker, just backpacking. Can you help me train a bunch of college students in the outdoor program to teach them how to be a climbing team and take them on an expedition in Nepal? And I realized this was a fork in the road, that I could share with them what I had learned, both from the good days of all those years of climbing and the bad days from what happened to Mike and other rescues I'd helped out on of others. It was a chance to pass along the skills. And I felt a nervousness, but a surge of responsibility to pass on what I'd learned. So I started helping to teach the young people climbing. And that's what really got me not only back into serious climbing, but onto expedition climbing. I'm still a climber now, 31 years later. I've been on a couple dozen expeditions, including to Everest and through some other difficult situations.
You've summited Mount Everest.
Yep. Mike goes with me on all these climbs spiritually, and it's mostly good. Now, occasionally I get a little sad, but sometimes I'll look around and I go, just look at this place, Mike. This is incredible. So I've been on expeditions to the Andes and Alaska and Himalayas and whatnot. And yes, I've actually been to Everest twice. And the first time I couldn't summit because I was there during the 2015 earthquake. And that may be a story for another day. But what I found there was the things that I'd gone through, the tough climbs, both the successful ones and the difficult days, actually enduring those hardships, I think made me a little bit hardier, hopefully a little bit better teammate to my team when the earthquake happened, and I could contribute a little bit to the team. So those difficult experiences from the past sharpen our skills, make us more resilient, and allow us to be a better version of ourselves, both for good challenges ahead and for tough days ahead, because who knew I'd be on Everest at Camp 1 during an earthquake at 20,000 feet and would have to work with my teammates and my neighbors to get out of it. But all the difficult things that had happened to me, including Rainier, I think sharpened me up a little bit and made me into a better climber and hopefully a better teammate.
It's those life experiences. I think what's super important here, and when I hear your story, it's you can either look at life as traumatic experiences and sort of always live in that moment and never really get out of it. Or you can look at them as life experiences, learn from them, take the positives from them, move forward. And when you learn, you grow. When you grow, you become a better version of yourself. Do you look at everything now through a positive lens, knowing that, things could go wrong at the flick of a switch?
Yes, it is a mixed blessing. Like you say, those difficult situations are heavy and traumatic. It takes a little while to get balance again and start moving forward. But I've written some books about this, and I speak about this internationally. And I try and share the story that we all have different problems. My crevasse was an actual glacial crevasse, a crack in the ice. But there's other crevasses in life, like earthquakes and storms and economic setbacks and pandemics. And those traumatic things can shut you down. But I think instead to honor the opportunity we've been given and honor those who have helped us get this far is to try and distill some lessons from that. And psychiatrists have noticed that it can lead to growth, post-traumatic growth. And I talk about that in my writings and my books to encourage people that, yes, traumatic things are going to happen. We can't bring back those that we've lost. We can't turn the clock back before the earthquake or the war or the pandemic, but we can learn from it, distill some strength, some wisdom and some resilience, and take that with us to the next challenge, the next opportunity, and share it with other people to pass on the gift that we've been lucky enough to get given to us to help out others for their challenge ahead. And that's what drives me now. And I think that's part of what drives you and putting the show out to share with people to help them deal with all the problems that we're all going to wind up facing.
I think that's ultimately what all we can do is just give back from our life experiences and our knowledge to hopefully inspire or to get someone out of a sticky situation. Jim, you are the epitome of head game. You've had to get your head or keep your head in the game to get you out of some severely complicated situations. Listen, Jim, thanks so much. Stay positive, keep doing what you're doing and keep passing on that knowledge and that robust and resilient mindset that you have. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure, Ant. Thanks for having me on, Ant.
Thanks so much for joining me on Head Game. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of our incredible stories. And leave me a review wherever you're listening. I'm Ant Middleton. Catch you again next time.